Hello, and welcome to this episode of Catching the Octopus podcast. Today, we're going to be speaking about the Four Noble Truths. And the Four Noble Truths, although it is a Buddhist principle, it actually is, I suppose, the life hack to being able to create a life that is fulfilling and that has all the really good bits in it, right? And less of the really challenging bits or the bits that are unhelpful. And so, simply, it is kind of four truths. One, there is suffering in life. Two, suffering has a cause. Three, suffering can end. And four, there is a path that leads to the end of suffering. And now, this is also very similar to the principle that we use in, say, like modern medical situations, right? So when we're looking at medicine, we're going to be, we'd go to the doctor, something would be going on in our body or something going on with us, and the doctor would go, okay, let's diagnose the illness. Let's see what is there. Let's identify why it's there, and then explain that you can heal from that, and then prescribe treatment. And that's kind of what the Four Noble Truths does, right? So it looks at our lives and we go, okay, what is the problem? The problem is that there is suffering, and there is suffering in every person's life. And that can look very different to a lot of different people. And once we've identified that, we'll go in that in a bit deeper in a moment, then we can go, okay, well, why is there suffering? Where does the suffering come from in this human experience that we have? And then once we identify that there is suffering and it does come from somewhere, then we can reassure ourselves that we can move through this and then give ourselves a pathway, which is called the Eightfold Path, right? A pathway that can help us move through that. Now, the Four Noble Truths are pretty much about accepting that there is going to be suffering that happens in your life from time to time. And it's understanding, though, that sometimes we're suffering unnecessarily. And so, what it's about is being able to get free of that and become free of that. And these are Buddhists' first, this is, Buddha's first teaching. So after Buddha attained enlightenment beneath the Bodhi tree, and I've been very, very blessed to be able to have done a meditation under the Bodhi tree in India, in Bodhi Gaya. So after he did that, the Buddha's first sermon explained these Four Noble Truths, right? And so they've remained a foundation of the Buddhist tradition for probably, I think it's about 2,500 years, right? So for over 2,500 years, this has been a core element of the Buddhist teachings. Now, they are just that, right? They're teachings. It's not a set of rules or commandments or anything like that. They're just observations about how the mind works. And so, whether you fully believe in Buddhist teachings or not, whether you have other religious prescriptions that you believe in and have beliefs and faith with, it doesn't change the fact, though, that our minds create suffering. And this is a kind of way to be able to move through that. And there are different, so God, for if you choose to believe God, source, universe, energy, whatever it is that you prescribe to in that space and whatever you have faith in, they're pretty clever, right? That energy is super, super clever. And so they recognize that on this world, in this human existence, there's so many different people and we relate to things in such different ways. So God was kind of like, you know what? If we're going to be able to create an environment that sets up the foundation of how people can get the best out of this human experience, going to have to send a couple of different teachers, a couple of different methods in the way that they teach, a couple of different ways they prescribe their teachings, and a couple of different teachers to be able to connect with the different people. And so we had things like Muhammad and Jesus and Buddha and, many, many more gods and deities that are out there as well. But the teachers that came here in human form all share the same core messages. And those same core messages are around love, love for oneself and love for the people around us, and treating others the way we would like to be treated, and doing everything from an essence of love, and helping each other and caring for each other. And there might be a whole lot of other stuff that falls into the teachings as well, but the essence of every different religious prescription is the same. Now, like humans as we are, we can distort teachings, right? And we can adapt those to be able to fit a narrative or fit an agenda or fit a methodology that we want it to fit. And so all of those things within different types of religions have happened over time. And at one point, some religions were used as control tactics. And there's some religions that have fear-based narratives, like, going to hell. And there's some religions that do this and that and the other. So my debate today isn't about religion. My sharing, or my learnings that I wanted to share today, is more around there's more than one way to skin a cat. And if you can find all of the different cat skinners and find out what they all have in common, then maybe that's the thing that we can actually take on board, right? And take some of our own learnings from. And so when it comes to the Four Noble Truths, this is about kind of more prescriptive processes. And so some religions are based around worship and devotion and those sorts of things. And there's some context and teachings that are based around more intellectual stuff. And if you have a look at the Buddhist teachings are more about the intellectual. So they're more about, hey, if you follow these steps, then this could happen for you. And if you do this and that, this could happen for you. And it was kind of like Buddha's teachings were more of a, here's some tools, go and do stuff. And if we compare that to my learnings that I received through Christianity, is Jesus was very devotional to people, and he would heal them and then would tell them to go and be a good person, right? And to go out and live life as he does, and have the whole love aspect in the way that you show up for other people. Whereas with the Buddhist teachings, it's more about, hey, if you want to do these things, then you will be healed. So it's a little different way on the way that it comes across. And so Buddha, when he shared these truths, the Four Noble Truths, he wasn't saying that life's terrible. And so some people misinterpret this to go, all life is suffering. No, 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 no. Not all life is suffering, but in life there is suffering, right? So basically life contains unavoidable dissatisfaction, right? And that can come in the form of stress or disappointment or grief, frustration for different things. Anxiety is a cause of suffering. Sometimes when we feel that I'm not enough and that emptiness, that can cause us suffering. Uncertainty is another element. If we're not sure of what's happening, that can create suffering within us. And so sometimes even the best experiences we have don't always last. And that's like the law of cycles. We can talk about that in another podcast episode. But today we're looking more at this whole nothing lasts forever. So holidays end. If you're a parent, there's going to be a point where your children grow up. They also go through different stages and change. Relationships change. They're not always in the honeymoon phase. They can go through different spaces as well. Sometimes they end. You might have, if you look at your own career, that evolves. You might have different jobs, or different work colleagues may leave that you really enjoyed working with. Our health can change over time as well. We age, nothing we can do about that. So nothing stays the same, right? And unfortunately, some humans are wired with this negativity bias, and all of us have a brain that tries to look for risk, right? Because it wants to keep us safe. And so our brains have evolved to notice danger more than they've evolved to notice pleasure and what brings us pleasure. So even when life sometimes looks great, right? We can go, gee, this is, things are going really well for me. The mind can often still start searching for what's missing. And this is where gratitude comes in really important, because when we're always exercising gratitude and always looking at what we can be grateful for, then we're training our brain to no longer just be focusing on what's missing, but be focusing on what we have. And there's many people that I've spoken to that are in a point in their life where they are looking at what's missing and they miss the fact that what they're living is what they dreamed for 5, 10, 15 years ago, right? They might have dreamed to have a family and now they're looking at not getting sleep and not having enough time, solo time, right? So this is where the brain can kind of play into that space. And so that's where the element of suffering is. There is suffering in life. Now, well, what causes the suffering? Right? That's the next step of the noble truths. And this doesn't mean that, things around you don't matter and that we're living an earthly experience. I suppose I'll do this way, right? We are here as humans. We're living a human experience in a human form. And with that form comes things like emotions, right? And so sometimes those emotions can cloud the way that we would view the things around us. So when we come into that space of the three things we can control, if you've listened to enough of my teachings or my learnings, you will actually know that there's only three things we can really control. Say it with me. They are the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we behave. And so coming into a space where we have more of a grasp on that can reduce our suffering when we understand where the suffering is coming from. So when the Buddha was giving these teachings, it was identified that attachment or craving is the main cause, or how I like to kind of look at it is the ability to detach. Sorry, the inability rather to detach is what causes suffering. So it's the aspect of I need this to be able to be happy, or this is, changing and I never wanted it to change. It is, I can't do this. No one loves me. I'm unlovable. I'm not enough. It comes from things should be looking different. The belief system of this should look different. Right. And so when we're attached to things or the outcomes, when we have expectations of how things should look and how things should feel around us, then what our brain is looking at then is saying, well, it's only when my reality matches those expectations that I'm going to be okay. Because if my reality isn't matching those expectations, then there's still something missing. And the brain then focuses on, okay, what's missing? Right? And that's where the suffering can come in. And so we have so many things today that really keep us in that space of attachment. And social media is a main one, right? It thrives on attachment, comparing different elements, getting validation from the likes on the posts, seeing that there's people around there that look perfect. Because when they present themselves on social media, they're aiming for that perfection, right? It's looking at how many follows we have, how successful a post was. And so we've got this external world around us. It's not just social media, either social contexts as well do this. We tend to sometimes compare our lives with our neighbors or friends or people down the street. We often will compare ourselves on, how many friends we've got, or if someone doesn't text us back quick enough that we're not enough, all those sorts of things, right? And so the external world is constantly telling us you'll finally be enough when, right? You will be enough when you have that new car. You will be enough when you get that job, or when you are earning X amount, or when you have a partner, or when you have kids, excuse me, or when those kids get older, whatever it might be. We're looking at this space of a belief system within us that has expectations that we'll set up, and then we will be happy or we will be enough when these expectations are met. And if these expectations aren't met, then that incites a whole range of emotions that come through us. But with the way that the Buddha was showcasing this was saying that that is the trap, right? That is the trap of having these expectations of where things sit, and being able to detach from that basically falls into having the suffering end. And so anyone that's gone through a situation, whether it's the loss of a loved one and they're looking at grief, or the end of a relationship, or the loss of a job, or any of those sorts of things, we finally start feeling better when we have acceptance of, okay, this is what it is, right? That's when the suffering starts to end. Now, that doesn't mean that something might not pop up. A smell, a memory, a song, something like that might not pop up and it regenerates all those emotions again, right? And we're back in the space of going, oh, that wasn't fair. Or I wish it could be different. Or I wish that hadn't have worked out that way. Whatever that whole attachment to the expectation is, right? So when we're looking through this, it's about going, okay, when I finally have acceptance that how this is how it is, and it no longer controls you and it no longer influences the way you think, feel, or behave, that's when the suffering begins to end. Now, that doesn't mean that you're never going to feel sadness again, because there's other things that might pop up that might be little different triggers. So for me, I had one of my biggest triggers was around rejection, right? And not being loved, not being enough. And so probably the most recent one that really got me was a relationship ending. And when the relationship ended, I felt this immense sadness, almost bordering on a grief aspect of what I had lost, and going through all the things that could I have done this differently? What if this had been differently? And what made it so severe is I had put a whole lot of hope on this relationship because the connection was so intense that I hadn't given myself any other option than this working out and us being in each other's lives for the rest of our lives, right? And so when that didn't happen, it was just like it broke apart all of my ideals, and I had difficulty detaching from that. Now, how I got through that was I recognized, okay, so where is this suffering coming from? Is coming from the ability to detach. Okay, so why do I feel so triggered by this? Why is this really inciting these feelings and thoughts and behaviors from me? And when I dug in deeper, it was around rejection. And so I had childhood rejection wounds. So I went in, did the healing process around that. And then when I came to the point where I accepted that, okay, this obviously wasn't meant for me, or I would have been doing it, and I detached from any expectations around that, that was when I started coming back into myself. That was when the suffering ended for me. And so that is when I was no longer controlled by the situation, right? So pain is inevitable, but suffering is what we add in afterwards. It's painful for a relationship to end, yes, but the suffering is the days and weeks and months, and sometimes for some people, years that we pine over something that isn't going to change, right? So if we look at losing a job, the pain is I lost my job. The suffering is, oh, I'm worthless, or my future is ruined, or this always happens to me. You know, all of that programming and dialogue. I'm a failure. You know, so there's this one event that happens, and then there's all these stories that get created in the mind from it. And those stories are what create the suffering that someone's going through. And so when we look at how we would manage this, it's very similar and it aligns with cognitive based therapy or behavior therapy, right? CBT. Also, acceptance and commitment therapy, mindfulness based stress reduction. There's all different elements that you can do from a therapy basis that recognize that our interpretation of our environment or of a situation and the stories we create creates most of our distress. And so this, although this was taught by Buddha way in the day, it's actually been picked up by modern psychology. And a lot of therapy that we do in the therapy space is around this. It's around changing the story and looking at what is the story? Why is the story there? What is the story doing? Okay, how can we shift that story? I talk a lot about reframing in the work that I do, reframing something. And, you know, I was having a catch up with my sister-in-law not long back, and she actually mentioned how that I would always find positive things in stuff. Now that I've trained my brain to do that, because I know that if I create a positive story around something that's happening, then it reduces my suffering. Right? And so, yes, when something happens, I understand there's pain. I process the pain, but then I don't allow it to create suffering for me. And that's what you do when you're in a healed space. Before you heal, you have something that causes pain, and then you go into suffering, right? And some people, unfortunately for them, the suffering is their identity. And it's hard for them to get into a healing space because they're living in suffering, and suffering is who they are. Suffering is, some people wear it as a badge of honor that I've gone through this and I do this and I cope through this and I do that. And it's a badge that they wear that they are a king of suffering. And so for other people, they don't feel like they're worthy of having a life that isn't full of suffering. So they will fall into the suffering pattern. But coming into a spot where we can go, hey, hang on, I've had enough of suffering, is when we start then reevaluating and having a look and going, what do I need to detach from? I need to detach from this belief system, or I need to detach from this expectation, or I need to detach from this programming, social programming. You know, my expectations, external expectations, all those sorts of things. And so detaching is the element. And then we can look at, well, how do we detach? It's not as easy as it sounds. Well, it isn't, but it is. And the more that you do it, the more that it will become easy. And so, as well as giving us the Four Noble Truths, Buddha also gave us what he referred to as the Eightfold Path. And I'll do another podcast on the Eightfold Path because we can go really in depth on those elements around that, right? So, when we're looking at the path, though, we need to understand that this path is a practice. So, freedom isn't luck. When you see someone that has an ultimate amount of self-love, is secure in themselves, their self-esteem is high, and their self-esteem and self-confidence isn't arrogance, though. They're still kind to other people. They still show up with empathy. They still are vulnerable in spaces, but they have boundaries on what they will and won't accept in accordance with the behaviors towards them, right? That's where that self-love and self-confidence comes in. And so when we're looking at someone in that space that's done the healing, that's got to that point, they have learnt a way to manage the suffering. Right? And the suffering is no longer their identity. It no longer controls them. It no longer has the influence over the way they think and feel and behave. And so there's three kind of components to the Eightfold Path. So there's one component that looks at wisdom and the way that we can use wisdom in how we operate day to day. There's another element that looks at ethical living. How are we being ethical? What are our morals and our values? And are we showing up in a space that showcases that day to day? And then there's also a component that looks at mental training. And that's looking at how then we rewire our brain. How can we get to a point where this is our default rather than the triggers and the wounding being our default? And so it's about gradually rewiring basically how we think and how we respond. So going back again and gaining the control over those three things, say it with me, the way we think, the way we feel, and the way we behave. They're the three things that we have control over, right? So here's a couple of analogies I could probably use to showcase this in a different way. So I don't know if you've ever heard of the Chinese finger trap, right? So with the Chinese finger trap, the harder you pull, the tighter it gets, right? And so the only freedom you can get from a Chinese finger trap is from relaxing. And so that's the same thing with attachment, right? And for me, when I go back to that relationship example, the more that relationship was falling away, the more I tried to grip at it. And I actually went into an anxious attachment style, right? I was clawing and gripping and trying everything I could to try and make sure that relationship worked. And it still didn't. And that's why I suffered so deeply because of it, because I didn't have the ability to have acceptance and to detach from my expectations. I expected this person was going to be my person, which didn't work out that way, right? So again, if you look at something like quicksand, if you panic, you're going to sink faster in the quicksand. The whole element around that is becoming calm, and that allows escape. So these are analogies that are conducive to healing. If we keep digging ourselves deeper, it's going to be harder for us to get out. Whereas once we get into a point of going, okay, I've experienced something that's painful, I'm in the human form. I have to live a human existence, and this is my experience as a human. I'm going to make the most of that. I'm going to feel these emotions. Yes, they're yuck. Yes, I don't really love sitting in them, but I'm going to feel them. And then once I've felt them and I've acknowledged them and I've got what I've needed to learn from them, then I detach from them. Right. And then that's where that calmness comes, and that's where we can escape from that suffering. Okay, so the path here, in the practical path that leads to the end of suffering, in what we'll go through in a bit more depth in the next episode, more than likely, I said, as I mentioned, is grouped into different areas. So the wisdom area is looking at the right viewpoint and the right intention. And then we look at the ethical conduct and where our values sit. And that's looking at right speech, right action, right livelihood. And then we have the mental discipline part, which is the right effort and the right mindfulness and the right concentration, right? So that's the eightfold path. It gives us 8 things to have a look at. Now, it's not a checklist, it's more of a lifelong practice, right? Of cultivating that wisdom, compassion, and awareness in the way that we do things. And so when we're looking at some of the things that happen within us, there's some ways that we can process the things in using the truth in our everyday situations. So if we look at work, for example, there's been times where people will say, oh, you know, when I get that promotion or when I get that pay rise or when I'm on that amount of money, that's when I'm going to be happy. That's what I'm striving towards. But yet the promotion arrives or the pay rise arrives or you're on that sort of money, and then a short term after you've moved the goalposts again. Now, from a goal driven perspective, that's great. But if we're living in a place of not being enough and having suffering in our life from it, that's not great, right? When we look at, you know, parenting with our children, supposed to stay little, then they get up, grow up, and then they move out and they do their own thing. That creates pain. But if we don't process the pain, then that can cause into suffering. With our health, not everyone is lucky enough to live a life that is pain-free and at optimum health. A lot of people have different ailments and different diagnoses. And when we get a diagnosis, that creates pain. But if we resist that and go against that, then that often doubles the suffering, right? So acceptance doesn't mean giving up and going, oh, I accept I've got this, that's it, I'm bedridden for the rest of my life. But what it does is it means you're starting to process things from a place of reality instead of fighting that reality. And I talk often about the inner child work. And inner child work is where we're processing some of these attachments. And so, hang on. Sorry, I had a Lamington before this, and I've got a little bit of what's it called? Coconut in my throat. Oh, it's been tickling my throat the whole episode. I don't know if you can tell. Sorry. All right. So going to childhood with our inner child, right? So in our inner child, we may have been conditioned to a range of different things. Maybe that I need to perform at this level, or I have to please, or I'm only lovable if X, Y, Z. And so for me, there was a big people pleasing element to my inner child that I needed to heal and I needed to nurture. There was a big element of being rejected and rejection that I needed to heal and I needed to nurture. And the lovable aspect as well. Like, why wasn't I loved in the way? And again, here's an attachment. This is a really good example. Why wasn't I loved like this? You know, why in those kinds of behaviors, how I would love someone wouldn't be around that. So then I wasn't lovable or I wasn't loved. Now, even though I'm sure my parents did love me, and I'm sure people around me, my family did love me, some of the ways that I was treated or the ways that things happened around me didn't always make me feel like I was loved. And so that programming can come through, right? And so healing the inner child stuff benefits because those beliefs being healed then reduce the attachment to needing to validate yourself through pleasing other people, through doing all of the things, being a perfectionist, etc., etc. And even with the work I do under the hypnosis element, right? This is looking at what subconscious programmings exist and what belief systems are in there that are making you think, feel, and behave, or influencing the way you think, feel, and behave at this point in time. And we go through a lot of that aspect of these are the three things you can control. And if you're not able to control them, let's have a look why. And let's release the lead that's attached to them, right? And so hypnosis can help with those subconscious attachments. And it's not about making people passive and programming them to go and do what they want to do. I mean, if hypnotherapists had the ability to do that, we'd be the top 1%, right? We'd be living in the Epstein class. But what it is about is changing those unconscious beliefs that drive that attachment, or that inability to detach, that drive the fear and the craving for something different than what we're actually presented with. And so having acceptance with what we're presented with is one of the key elements that can help end suffering. And I am a big one. If something happens, I have worked so hard on acceptance that I will actually tell myself verbally out loud, okay, that wasn't meant to be for me. Or if that's meant to be for me, that'll come around again. And I talked before about the difference between giving up and surrendering, right? And so knowing in yourself, okay, this is the time I need to surrender. This isn't for me. Versus, oh, that's too hard. I'm not doing it, which is giving up. But even in the space of surrendering, sometimes we might actually go, hey, I haven't exhausted all the avenues yet. But when you're pursuing those avenues, you're pursuing them as this potentially might be what gets me across the line, not I need this to get across the line, right? They're two different ways of thinking, and they're going to bring around two totally different results if it doesn't go the way that you planned. And so pain is inevitable, suffering is optional. Hatred is never appeased by hatred in this world. By non-hatred alone is hatred appeased. So if we're looking at that, all conditioned things are impermanent. Nothing stays the same. Everything's subject to change. And when we can actually get and understand that, then we're in a better position to be able to have the ability to detach from an expectation or detach from a perceived outcome and come into a healed space of self-love to know that everything around me is happening for me. I am loved unconditionally at a universal God source level. And so what I'm going through now is either teaching me something or setting me up for something better. It's not happening without purpose. And yes, it's created pain, and I'm going to process that pain. But I also know that once I come out of the pain, I don't need to sit in suffering. And that's kind of the key element of the teaching. And so in our next episode, we'll go a little bit deeper with the Eightfold Path, which will be the tools you can engage in the work of reducing that suffering. Anyway, I hope I added some value, and I look forward to serving you again in our next episode.